He thought he was about to turn a quiet stranger into the punchline of the evening. But before the night was over, his own reputation would be hanging by a thread. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe respect should never be based on appearances, be sure to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us that dignity still matters. Now, back to Claire Bennett. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Culinary Center glowed beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm golden light across polished marble floors. More than 200 guests filled the room, their voices blending into a steady hum of excitement as cameras rolled and waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays. At the center of it all stood Chef Marcus Sterling, America's celebrated television chef and owner of one of the most prestigious culinary academies in the country. His white chef's coat was perfectly pressed, his smile practiced, his confidence unmistakable. Tonight's event was being streamed live to thousands of viewers across the nation. Marcus loved nights like these. The attention, the applause, the certainty that every eye in the room was focused on him. What he loved even more was proving that he belonged at the top. Across the ballroom, unnoticed by almost everyone, sat Claire Bennett. She occupied a small table near the back wall beside a decorative arrangement of white roses. Her gray sweater looked ordinary. Her brown hair was pulled into a simple ponytail. She wore no expensive jewelry, no designer labels, nothing that suggested influence or importance. In fact, one waiter had already mistaken her for a staff member and politely asked if she needed directions to the service entrance. Claire had simply smiled and pointed toward her guest badge. The young man apologized and hurried away, embarrassed. She didn't seem offended. She rarely was. Claire quietly folded her hands in her lap and observed the room. Her blue eyes moved calmly across the crowd, taking in every detail. The chefs, the students, the judges, the television crew, the sponsors. It had been years since she had attended an event like this, and she seemed perfectly content remaining invisible. Meanwhile, Marcus was entertaining the audience with stories about culinary excellence and the sacrifices required to achieve greatness. The crowd laughed. Marcus Sterling adjusted the microphone clip to his collar and stepped toward the front of the demonstration kitchen that occupied the center of the ballroom. The audience immediately quieted, eager for whatever came next. Behind him, rows of stainless steel workstations gleamed beneath bright studio lights, while multiple cameras shifted into position. The evening had already been successful, but Marcus understood television better than most chefs. Talent attracted viewers. Drama kept them watching. He flashed a confident smile toward the audience. Tonight, he announced, spreading his arms wide, we are going to have a little fun. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Several guests leaned forward in anticipation. Marcus enjoyed controlling a room this way. Every pause, every gesture, every reaction. Then he pointed toward the back of the ballroom. You, ma'am. The lady near the roses. Hundreds of eyes turned simultaneously toward Claire Bennett. She looked up from her table, momentarily surprised. A spotlight found her almost instantly. The room filled with murmurs. People examined her simple clothes and exchanged curious glances. Marcus smiled wider. Would you join us for a moment? For a brief second, Claire considered declining. She had not attended the event seeking attention. In fact, she preferred the exact opposite. Yet something in Marcus's expression told her that refusing would only create a larger scene. Calmly, she rose from her chair and made her way through the ballroom. The polished marble reflected the overhead lights beneath her feet. As she approached the stage area, cameras followed her every step. Several guests whispered among themselves. One sponsor seated near the front chuckled quietly. Another guest pulled out a phone to record. Marcus greeted her with the kind of smile that looked friendly from a distance but felt different up close. Thank you for being a good sport, he said. Tell everyone your name. Claire Bennett, she replied softly. Wonderful. Marcus nodded. And Claire, what do you do? The question seemed simple enough. I work as a private consultant, she answered. Marcus raised an eyebrow. A consultant. He let the words linger. Not exactly a chef then. A few people laughed. Claire merely smiled politely. No, she said. Not exactly. Marcus turned toward the audience. Perfect. Then we have the ideal volunteer. More laughter followed. Behind him, several culinary students exchanged amused looks. To them, Claire appeared completely ordinary. Marcus began pacing slowly around the workstation. You see, everyone thinks cooking looks easy on television. Tonight we can finally test that theory. The audience responded with another wave of laughter. Claire remained composed. Her hands rested comfortably at her sides. No frustration appeared on her face. No embarrassment. If anything, her calmness seemed unusual. Marcus noticed it too. Most people became nervous under bright lights and public attention. Claire did not. That small detail irritated him more than he expected. He gestured toward a fully stocked workstation overflowing with premium ingredients. Fresh seafood rested on crushed ice. Handcrafted sauces lined the counter. Imported spices sat neatly arranged beside cutting boards. Claire, Marcus said, how would you feel about helping us with a little cooking challenge? The crowd applauded immediately. Camera operators moved closer. Somewhere in the audience, a producer grinned. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. At least, that was what Marcus believed. Claire looked at the ingredients. Then she looked back at him. If that is what you would like, she answered calmly. For the first time all evening, a strange silence flickered across part of the room. It lasted only a moment. But a few experienced chefs watching from the side suddenly became very interested in the woman standing beneath the lights. Marcus clasped his hands together as the audience settled into eager silence. He could feel the energy in the ballroom shifting exactly where he wanted it. Every camera remained fixed on Claire. Every guest waited for the inevitable mistake. Well, Claire, he said with a grin, since you seem willing to participate, let us make things a little more interesting. He walked toward a refrigerated display and began selecting ingredients. Fresh Maine lobster, wild mushrooms, imported truffles, a basket of seasonal vegetables. Then he added several specialty items that even experienced home cooks would struggle to identify. The audience watched carefully as he arranged everything across the workstation. Tonight, Marcus announced, our volunteer will prepare a signature fine dining entree using these ingredients. Several guests laughed quietly. One student chef whispered to another that the challenge was impossible. Another shook his head and smirked. Claire listened without reacting. Marcus continued, to make things fair, she will have 45 minutes. More laughter followed. Everyone understood the joke. Fine dining competitions often required years of training and endless practice. Yet here stood an ordinary woman in a gray sweater being asked to compete under professional conditions in front of hundreds of spectators. Marcus looked toward the judges seated near the front. Do we think she can do it? A few smiled politely. Others exchanged uncertain glances. No one offered a serious answer. Marcus turned back to Claire. Still interested? The question carried an edge hidden beneath friendly words. Claire studied the ingredients for several seconds. Her gaze moved slowly from one item to the next. Lobster, mushrooms, herbs, stocks, sauces, spices. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. It was not a nervous smile. It was not the smile of someone trying to impress people. It looked more like recognition, as though she were greeting old friends. Yes, she answered calmly. I think I can manage. The confidence in her voice was subtle, but several people noticed it. Marcus noticed it too. For a brief moment, he felt an irritation he could not explain. Most participants became anxious under pressure. Claire seemed comfortable. He quickly dismissed the thought. Across the ballroom, an elderly chef named Robert Hayes narrowed his eyes. He had spent more than 40 years in professional kitchens and had judged competitions around the world. Something about the way Claire examined the ingredients felt familiar. Not her face, not her voice, her focus, her patience. Professional chefs often revealed themselves through small habits long before they touched a knife. Robert leaned forward slightly in his chair. Nearby, a culinary student asked what he was looking at. I am not sure yet, Robert replied quietly. Back at the workstation, Marcus handed Claire a pristine white apron embroidered with the Academy logo. You will need this. Claire accepted it politely and tied it around her waist. The room grew quieter. The cameras moved closer. Bright studio lights reflected across the stainless steel surfaces. Somewhere near the back, a producer whispered that ratings would love this segment. Marcus stepped away from the station and raised one hand dramatically. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, let us see what happens when confidence meets reality. The audience applauded. Yet as Claire rested her fingertips lightly against the countertop and looked across the ingredients one final time, a strange feeling settled over part of the room. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. The feeling that perhaps the person everyone was laughing at knew something they did not. The countdown clock appeared on a large screen above the stage and began ticking down from 45 minutes. A soft tone echoed through the ballroom. Claire did not move immediately. While the audience expected panic or hesitation, she simply stood still and looked across the workstation. Her eyes moved slowly from ingredient to ingredient, studying each one with quiet concentration. Marcus folded his arms and watched from a few feet away. He expected uncertainty. Instead, he saw patience. The difference unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Time is running, Claire," he said with a faint smile. Several guests chuckled. Claire nodded politely. "Thank you." Then she finally began. Her movements were unhurried. She selected a chef's knife and tested its balance with a familiarity that did not go unnoticed by Robert Hayes. The veteran chef narrowed his eyes again. Most amateurs held professional knives awkwardly. Claire held hers naturally, as though it belonged in her hand. She began organizing ingredients into precise groups across the workstation. Vegetables to one side. Herbs arranged neatly near the cutting board. Proteins separated with careful attention. Every action seemed deliberate. Across the audience, some of the laughter started to fade. A young culinary instructor leaned toward his colleague. "She is setting up her station correctly." His colleague shrugged. "Maybe she watches cooking shows." Yet even he sounded less certain than before. Marcus stepped closer to one of the cameras. "Organization is important," he explained to the audience. Of course, organization alone does not make someone a chef. The crowd responded with polite laughter. Claire appeared not to hear him. She continued preparing her workstation with calm efficiency. Then she began cutting vegetables. The knife moved smoothly across the board. Uniform slices fell into perfect rows. Not fast, not flashy, precise. One camera operator lowered his headset slightly and stared. Another zoomed in on Claire's hands. Robert Hayes sat forward in his chair. The room was growing quieter with every passing minute. Claire transitioned from vegetables to herbs. Again, each cut was exact. No wasted movement. No hesitation. No corrections. She looked less like someone learning and more like someone remembering. Marcus noticed the shift in the atmosphere. He quickly tried to regain control. "Well," he announced loudly, "confidence is admirable. But the real challenge begins when technique meets pressure." Yet even as he spoke, several guests were no longer watching him. Their attention remained fixed on Claire. At a nearby table, two sponsors exchanged curious looks. One whispered, "Has she done this before?" The other simply shrugged. Claire continued working. Her expression remained peaceful. No sign of stress crossed her face. The giant countdown clock kept moving. 40 minutes remained. Then 39. Then 38. A strange tension began spreading through the ballroom. It was no longer the anticipation of seeing someone fail. It was something entirely different. People were beginning to question their assumptions. Marcus still believed he was controlling the evening. He still believed the challenge would eventually expose Claire's limitations. But somewhere deep inside, a small doubt had begun to form. And for the first time since stepping onto that stage, Chef Marcus Sterling found himself wondering whether he had made a very public mistake. 35 minutes remained on the clock when the first real shift occurred. It was subtle at first, almost invisible beneath the glow of studio lights and the quiet hum of camera equipment. Claire had already completed several foundational preparations that most guests could not fully appreciate, but the professionals in the room certainly could. Robert Hayes was one of them. He had stopped speaking entirely. His eyes followed every movement she made. Across 4 decades in professional kitchens, he had learned that true expertise often revealed itself through details invisible to ordinary observers. Claire's station remained immaculate. Every ingredient had a purpose. Every motion seemed connected to the next. Nothing looked accidental. Nothing looked improvised. Marcus noticed Robert watching and walked toward the judge's table. "Interesting volunteer, is she not?" he asked with forced confidence. Robert did not immediately answer. Instead, he continued observing Claire as she carefully prepared a reduction sauce. The consistency appeared flawless. The timing appeared exact. Finally, Robert spoke. "Where did you find her?" Marcus laughed. "She is just a guest." Robert slowly turned toward him. "Are you sure?" The question lingered longer than Marcus expected. Before he could respond, a sudden aroma drifted through the ballroom. Several guests lifted their heads. Conversation stopped. A woman near the front closed her eyes briefly as the scent reached her table. Rich herbs, butter, delicate seafood, layers of flavor unfolding through the air. The reaction spread from table to table. People who had been casually watching now found themselves paying closer attention. Claire remained focused. She did not glance at the audience. She did not acknowledge the cameras. She simply continued cooking. That calmness was beginning to unsettle everyone around her. One culinary student whispered, "She acts like she has done this 1,000 times." Another nodded slowly. Nearby, a young instructor crossed his arms. Nobody develops knife control like that by accident. The room was changing. What had started as entertainment was becoming something else entirely. Marcus sensed it. He returned to the stage and addressed the audience. "Well, appearances can be deceiving," he joked. "Perhaps Claire has been practicing in secret." A few people laughed politely, but the response felt weaker than before. Their attention remained fixed on Claire. 28 minutes remained. Claire moved to the lobster. The ballroom grew quieter. Her hands worked with calm precision. Not hurried, not dramatic. Professional. One camera operator zoomed in closer. A producer watching from the control station frowned. "Do we know who this woman is?" he asked through his headset. No one had an answer. Then another unexpected moment occurred. Claire performed a plating technique so elegant and refined that Robert Hayes immediately sat upright. His eyes widened slightly. It was the first visible reaction he had shown all evening. "No," he whispered. "That cannot be." The chef beside him looked confused. "What is it?" Robert continued staring. "I have seen that technique before." "Where?" Robert did not answer immediately. His expression had changed completely. The confidence of certainty was giving way to disbelief. Somewhere in the back of his memory, an old image was beginning to return. A championship stage. A crowded arena. A woman receiving a standing ovation years ago. The memory was incomplete, but it was getting closer. Much closer. And while Marcus Sterling still believed he was leading the evening, the truth was already moving toward him like an approaching storm that only a few people in the room could see. 22 minutes remained on the clock when the atmosphere inside the ballroom changed completely. The playful energy that had filled the room earlier was gone. No one was laughing anymore. Guests who had once viewed Claire as an amusing distraction now watched her with growing fascination. Even the waitstaff seemed distracted as they moved between tables. The cameras remained locked on her workstation. Every motion mattered now. Claire carefully lifted a saucepan and examined the consistency of her reduction. She adjusted the heat by the smallest margin and returned her attention to the rest of the dish. There was something remarkable about the way she worked. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing appeared forced. Every decision seemed to arrive exactly when it was needed. Marcus Sterling noticed it too. He stood near the judge's table pretending to remain relaxed, but the confidence that had defined him earlier was beginning to crack. He had expected mistakes by now. Hesitation. Confusion. A visible sign that Claire had reached the limits of her ability. Instead, she looked more comfortable with each passing minute. Across the room, Robert Hayes continued studying her every move. The memory in his mind was becoming clearer. Years ago, he had served as a judge at one of the most prestigious culinary championships in North America. Thousands of competitors had come and gone. Most faces had faded with time. Yet certain performances never left a judge's memory. Robert remembered a woman whose dishes had stunned audiences year after year. A woman known not for flashy presentations or dramatic television appearances, but for extraordinary technical mastery and consistency. He remembered a standing ovation. He remembered journalists calling her one of the finest culinary talents of her generation. Most of all, he remembered a specific plating technique that almost nobody else could execute with the same elegance. His eyes returned to Claire's workstation. Then he saw it again. The exact same technique. Robert's expression changed. He leaned closer. A younger chef seated beside him noticed immediately. "You know who she is, do not you?" Robert did not answer right away. His gaze never left Claire. "I think I do," he finally whispered. The younger chef looked stunned. "Then why has nobody recognized her?" Robert glanced around the ballroom. "Because nobody was looking." Those words carried more truth than anyone realized. For nearly an hour, most people had been focused on her clothes, her quiet demeanor, and their assumptions. Very few had actually paid attention to the person standing in front of them. Meanwhile, Claire continued cooking with complete concentration. The giant countdown clock displayed 19 minutes remaining. A producer near the control booth suddenly approached Marcus. "Chef," he said quietly, "our live audience numbers are climbing fast." Marcus frowned. "What?" "People are sharing clips online. Everyone wants to know who she is." Marcus looked back toward Claire. For the first time all evening, he found himself asking the same question. And somewhere deep inside, he was beginning to suspect that the answer was going to change everything. 15 minutes remained when the first crack finally appeared in the wall of certainty surrounding Marcus Sterling. It happened so quietly that most guests did not notice at first. Claire lifted a tasting spoon, sampled a sauce she had been refining for nearly 20 minutes, and made a microscopic adjustment with a pinch of seasoning. Robert Hayes immediately exhaled and leaned back in his chair. The younger chef beside him turned toward him. "You know now, do not you?" Robert nodded slowly. His eyes never left Claire. "I know. Who is she?" Robert hesitated. Even saying the name felt unreal after all these years. "If I am right," he said quietly, "then everyone in this room owes that woman an apology." The younger chef stared at him in confusion. Before he could ask another question, Claire began assembling the final components of her dish. The precision was extraordinary. Every element seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment. Temperatures matched perfectly. Colors balanced naturally. Textures complemented one another without effort. What astonished the professionals was not simply the quality. It was the confidence. Claire never second-guessed a decision. She never stopped to reconsider a step. She moved like someone following a map she had memorized long ago. The ballroom had become almost silent now. Even the production crew seemed reluctant to interrupt the atmosphere. Marcus noticed the silence more than anyone. Earlier that evening, every eye had been on him. Now the audience barely reacted when he spoke. Their attention belonged to Claire. A producer approached him again. "Chef, social media is exploding." Marcus forced a smile. "That is good for the show. People are asking who she is." The producer lowered his voice. "Several famous chefs are commenting on the live stream." Marcus felt a small knot tighten in his stomach. Across the stage, Claire carefully arranged the final garnish. Then she stepped back and examined her work. For the first time all evening, she appeared satisfied. Robert Hayes suddenly rose from his seat. The movement drew immediate attention. Conversation stopped. Cameras shifted toward him. As one of the most respected figures in the culinary world, Robert rarely acted without reason. Marcus turned toward him. "Chef Hayes." Robert slowly approached the workstation. His expression carried equal parts disbelief and admiration. He studied the completed plate for several seconds. Then he looked directly at Claire. "I have been trying to remember where I knew that technique from," he said softly. Claire met his gaze, but said nothing. Robert smiled. "Now I remember." A hush fell across the ballroom. The younger chefs exchanged nervous glances. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Robert turned toward the audience. "Years ago, I judged one of the greatest championship performances I have ever witnessed." The room remained perfectly still. The chef who created that performance disappeared from public life shortly afterward. He looked back at Claire. "I never expected to see her again." Marcus froze. Several guests leaned forward in their chairs. Claire remained calm. Robert's next words landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Tell me, Claire," he said gently, "are you the same Claire Bennett who won the National Culinary Championship not once, not twice, but 10 times?" The room went completely silent. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound in the ballroom came from the faint hum of the studio lights above the stage. Claire looked at Robert Hayes and offered a small, almost apologetic smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when a secret they never intended to reveal suddenly becomes impossible to hide. Then she nodded once. The reaction was immediate. Gasps spread across the room. Several guests stared at her in disbelief. A few younger chefs looked completely confused, but the older professionals knew exactly what Robert had just uncovered. They remembered the headlines. They remembered the championships. They remembered the woman who had dominated culinary competitions year after year before disappearing from public life at the height of her success. Marcus Sterling felt the color drain from his face. "That is not possible," he said quietly. Robert turned toward him. "It is." His voice carried absolute certainty. "I judged 4 of those championship victories myself." The room went silent again. Cameras immediately zoomed toward Claire. Producers scrambled behind the scenes. Viewership numbers climbed even higher as clips of the revelation spread across social media. Yet Claire seemed completely unaffected by the chaos surrounding her. She simply stood beside her workstation with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. One of the sponsors rose from his table. "You are telling us this is Claire Bennett?" Robert nodded. 10 national titles. Multiple international awards. One of the most respected culinary competitors of her generation. The sponsor looked stunned. "Then why have I never seen her on television?" A shadow of sadness crossed Claire's face. Robert glanced toward her before answering. "Because she walked away." The audience listened carefully. Robert continued. "Years ago, after reaching the top of the profession, she chose a different life. No interviews. No endorsements. No television contracts. She disappeared." Claire finally spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. "My father became ill." The ballroom remained perfectly still. There were more important things than trophies. Nobody interrupted her. "After he passed away, I realized I no longer wanted the spotlight." She looked around the room. "So I left it behind." The simplicity of her answer somehow carried more weight than any dramatic speech could have. Across the stage, Marcus struggled to find words. Earlier that evening, he had treated her like an amateur. A joke. A source of entertainment. Now he understood that he had spent the last hour publicly challenging someone whose accomplishments far exceeded his own. The realization settled heavily over him. Meanwhile, Robert approached the finished plate and examined it carefully. Several judges joined him. One by one, they tasted the dish. Their reactions spoke louder than words. Eyebrows lifted. Eyes widened. Heads nodded. Not a single judge looked disappointed. The audience watched every expression. Marcus watched too, and with every passing second, he understood more clearly that the story he thought he was directing had never belonged to him at all. It belonged to the quiet woman standing under the lights, the woman nobody bothered to recognize until it was too late. The judges finished tasting in complete silence. One after another, they placed their forks down and exchanged looks that required no explanation. The verdict was already visible on their faces. Robert Hayes was the first to speak. Extraordinary. His voice carried through the ballroom without effort. Balanced. Refined. Technically flawless. Another judge nodded immediately. "This is championship-level work." A third judge smiled. "No, this is beyond that. This is the work of someone who has mastered her craft." The audience erupted into applause. What began as scattered clapping quickly grew into a standing ovation that rolled across the ballroom like a wave. Guests rose from their chairs. Sponsors stood. Culinary students stood. Even members of the production crew joined in. The sound echoed beneath the chandeliers. Claire looked genuinely surprised. She lowered her eyes for a moment and smiled modestly. Marcus Sterling remained motionless. Earlier that evening, he had expected laughter at Claire's expense. Now the entire room was celebrating her. The contrast could not have been more complete. Finally, Marcus stepped forward. For the first time all night, he seemed unsure of himself. The cameras followed him as he approached Claire's workstation. The ballroom gradually quieted. Everyone wanted to hear what he would say. Marcus looked at Claire and took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology." The words were simple, but they carried weight. "Tonight, I made assumptions about you before I knew anything about you." The room remained silent. "I thought I was giving the audience a joke." He glanced toward the crowd before looking back at Claire. "Instead, you reminded all of us of something important." Claire listened without interrupting. Marcus shook his head slightly. "I judged you by what I saw on the surface. That was my mistake." For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Claire smiled warmly. There was no anger in her expression, no desire to embarrass him. "We all make assumptions sometimes," she said softly. "The important thing is what we learn from them." Those words landed more deeply than any criticism could have. Several guests nodded. Robert Hayes smiled quietly. The audience responded with another round of applause. Nearby stood a young culinary student who had spent most of the evening watching in awe. Claire noticed him holding a notebook against his chest. Without hesitation, she picked up the finished plate and carried it over. "Would you like to try it?" she asked. The student looked stunned. "Me?" Claire nodded. "You." The young man accepted the plate carefully, almost afraid to touch it. The crowd smiled as he tasted the dish. His eyes widened instantly. Laughter and applause filled the room again. The atmosphere felt completely different now. warmer, humbler, more human. As the evening drew to a close, the cameras captured one final image. Not a celebrity chef standing beneath the spotlight. Not a championship trophy. Just a quiet woman in a simple gray sweater surrounded by people who finally saw her clearly. And in that moment, everyone in the ballroom learned the same lesson. Talent does not always announce itself. Greatness does not always seek attention. Sometimes the most remarkable person in the room is the one nobody notices until it is impossible to look away.